So I'm very pleased to present Dr. Sherry Boodram, CEO and co-founder of CannDelta, a leading regulatory and scientific cannabis and psychedelics consulting firm specializing in licensing and compliance support across North America. So Sherry, please take it away.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. I'm very pleased to be here today and to be invited to this great event. So just to jump right in, today I will be speaking to you about cannabis testing, ensuring safety and quality in a competitive market. So just a little bit about us at CannDelta. We're a leading regulatory and scientific cannabis consulting company. We work with clients across the US and Canada and outside of North America, so in many international markets where cannabis is emerging. The company was founded by myself and another co-founder, and we were both formerly with Health Canada before starting CannDelta. We have an excellent team of consultants that are highly educated and experienced and have previously worked in a variety of regulated industries. So about me, I am, as I mentioned, the CEO and co-founder of CannDelta. I started my career actually working at Health Canada in their medical cannabis program and in their controlled substances program. Actually, before that, I was a drug forensic chemist in their drug analysis lab. So I worked as a chemist, analyzed cannabis and other hard drugs very early on before there was really even an industry in place at that time. And then I transitioned into working as a drug forensic chemist. From that role into a compliance and enforcement officer, again, working in the medical cannabis program for Health Canada in the capacity of conducting on-site inspections of licensed producers and also reviewing licensing applications. And that was under the regimes of the MMPR and the ACMPR. And I contributed to the drafting of the Cannabis Act and regulations from the field level, being able to provide input into that drafting. And then I had left government at that point and started CannDelta. So I have a PhD in chemistry. I also have a post-diploma with honors in pharmaceutical regulatory affairs and quality assurance. Also have a certificate in cannabis law and regulation, and sit as a board member on the Canadian Association of Professionals in Regulatory Affairs, or CAPRA. So quick agenda here just to set the stage. I'm going to touch on a few broad items, and hopefully that will set the stage for the panel coming up later. We're going to talk about testing requirements and sampling, vendor qualifying a lab, equipment and method validation, industry realities and challenges, cannabis export, and then touching on some forward-looking thoughts. So jumping right in, testing requirements and sampling practices. Why do we test? We know that testing is important, but there are some core objectives of performing cannabis testing. We want to ensure that there are clear manufacturing outcomes, have some idea of our manufacturing process and its efficiencies. We want to ensure product quality, product safety, and of course, label accuracy. That's very important for the consumer so they know exactly what they're purchasing. And of course, we have, as license holders, they have the regulatory obligation to meet the requirement under the cannabis regulations to conduct testing. So under Section 89 of the cannabis regulations, license holders must not sell cannabis products to any person authorized under the provincial act, so retailers. They cannot sell to other license holders or export cannabis products unless the requirements of testing are met on those products. So what do we test and when do we conduct this testing? That's very important in the testing process. Under the cannabis regulations, license holders are required to test phytocannabinoids, contaminants, specifically microbial contaminants, and that includes aspects of things like total aerobic microbial counts, total combined use and mold counts, bacteria, toxins is also a very important consideration when looking at microbial contaminants. And also contaminants related to chemical contaminants, such as solvent residues and heavy metals. Now, pesticides are also considered chemical contaminants, but they're specifically sort of seen as a standalone testing requirement because of its importance. Testing is also required for dissolution and disintegration as well in certain circumstances and product formats. Other testings to be considered include foreign matter, water activity, moisture, terpenes, soil, and water. And oftentimes, moisture analysis is also performed when potency testing is performed. The reason being that moisture can give information on the manufacturing process, the cultivation process of the cannabis product, and can provide information on reasoning for why cannabinoid concentrations and quantity may be present in a cannabis product. So it's oftentimes the two tests are performed at the same time on a product lot or batch. Again, so analytical testing of soil, water, nutrients has importance in the quality and reproducibility. Many inputs have a strong influence on the yield, the plant health, and the cannabinoid profiles. There are impacts that result from cultivation style and location. So, we're looking at testing things like soil, nutrients, water. Other factors can come into play of quality, such as temperature, humidity, photo period, photospectrum, and gas exposure. So, for example, you could have an SOP that's being used in one facility, take that same SOP, bring it to another facility, and you'll most likely have different results when you're looking at the potency of cannabis. So to dive a little bit deeper into the testing parameters here, phytocannabinoids are required testing under Section 90 of the cannabis regulations. Testing is required for the quantity and concentration of THC, THCA, CBD, and CBDA. Oftentimes, other cannabinoids are tested if there is some benefit that the license holder is trying to convey on the specific brand to the consumers. For example, if the cannabis product has high enough levels of CBN, that can also be tested as well and provided on the label as other information. But required information that Health Canada is looking for includes the concentration of a THC and CBD, THCA, and CBDA. And those tests are required to be conducted on each lot or batch of cannabis, that cannabis product. The testing will be conducted on the final form of the cannabis, and that's a very important distinction, either before or after it is packaged and labeled as a cannabis product or a cannabis accessory that contains it. Contaminants testing is required as per Section 91 of the cannabis regulations. Testing for microbial and chemical contaminants other than residues of pesticides, which I mentioned earlier, must be conducted on each lot or batch of cannabis that will become a cannabis product, or each lot or batch of cannabis that is used as the input material that is going into a cannabis product. Health Canada has a great table that summarizes when the testing for contaminants should be conducted on the various classes of cannabis. You see on the table there on the left side is the class of cannabis. Beside that is the option for input cannabis only, final form of only, or the option of either final form or the input cannabis. Input cannabis only testing is required on edible cannabis, whereas for fresh cannabis, dried cannabis, cannabis topicals, and cannabis extracts, you can either perform the testing on the final form or the input cannabis material. And when it is tested on the input cannabis material, it's under very specific circumstances when there is certainty that it is the final processing step of that particular input material. Testing of contaminants are done to ensure that you can determine whether the contaminant is within acceptable tolerance limits for human use for the specified contaminant that's appropriate for that intended use, or the foreseeable use of that cannabis product. with the exception of edible cannabis, which must be appropriate for the product that it's being ingested. So intended use, or what the product will be used for in terms of ingestion if it's edible cannabis. It's important to make reference to established publications such as Schedule B of the Food and Drugs Act, and that's referenced in the cannabis regulation. It lists international publications such as EP, or European Pharmacopoeia, and that gives information on technical specifications for pharmaceutical drugs, herbal medicines, and dietary supplements, which in this case is to be applied to cannabis and the form of cannabis. License holders are required to maintain consistent specifications for their products according to these publications and assess each lot or batch of cannabis against those specifications before approving the release of a batch or lot for sale. And it's important to note that it's the license holder's responsibility to decide on the specifications and methods to be used for testing, and that should be determined before the test is actually conducted. In terms of pesticides, pesticide testing is required under Section 92.2 of the cannabis regulations. All cannabis plants and cannabis plant seeds that will become a cannabis product needs to be tested before sale or distribution or export. All fresh and dried cannabis that will become cannabis products need to be tested before using it in any processing activities such as milling or packaging. All industrial hemp, fresh and dried cannabis, cannabis plants, and cannabis plant seeds that will be used in the production of cannabis extracts, cannabis topicals, or edible cannabis need to be tested before using them in any processing activities such as extraction or formulation. And any cannabis that has not been previously tested in accordance with the mandatory testing requirements need to be tested before it's used in any processing activities. So if you are obtaining, say for example, a processor is obtaining dried flower from a cultivator, the expectation is that the cultivator has performed the mandatory pesticide testing and can provide the certificates of analysis and release records for that lot of cannabis, indicating that there are no pesticides that are above approved residual limits. And if that is not the case, then it is the processor's responsibility to conduct that testing, to make sure that they have tested for pesticides and it is below any of the limits before that cannabis is used in any further processing. Dissolution and disintegration testing is required under Section 91.1 of the cannabis regulations, and it's to be conducted if cannabis or cannabis accessory that contains cannabis or will become a cannabis product is in a discrete unit of a dosage form. So this is typically a tablet or a capsule. And testing must be conducted on each lot or batch of the cannabis and must be conducted on the final form of the cannabis. So now we've kind of set that framework. How do we prepare samples for testing? I spoke a lot about batches and lots. And sometimes those terms are used interchangeably within the industry. A batch in general terms refers to a defined quantity of products from the same production run, made under the same manufacturing conditions from the same materials. A lot is commonly referred to a group of items of the same SKU. Whichever way that you're defining it, defining a batch and a lot, it's critical for tracking and for testing purposes. And ultimately, the definition, how you're defining that, is specific to your operations, and it's determined by the specific license holder, and it's defined in approved SOPs. So that's very clear on what that is. If you get audited, Health Canada will know exactly how you're defining it. Your staff will know exactly how they're defining it and be able to track products appropriately. It's also necessary to obtain a representative sample of the batch or the lot for testing. A representative sample is a quantity of cannabis whose characteristics represent, as accurately as possible, the entire lot or batch. The quantity and quality of the samples should be proportional to and reflective of the total lot or batch. Sampling procedures are to be determined by the license holder and outlined in approved SOPs. The samples sent for testing should have undergone all required processing. So for example, if you're drying, milling, or freezing, all of those processing steps should be completed, and it's subject to the completion of the testing. So if you are not ready for that assessment at that point, then you need to make sure that the tests are performed only when the processing steps are done, so you can approve the lot or batch for sale. Okay, so to kind of explain the point of representative sample a little bit more, sometimes, as a consultant, you get questions on, okay, how do we exactly obtain a representative sample? Health Canada does not really have clear guidelines on what that is, but most often in the industry, what is referred to is the explanation that is in the European Pharmacopoeia 2.8.20, and there is a nice diagram which I have on the screen now, kind of explaining what the parameters are for determining a representative sample. So at the very top there, you see the number of containers of a batch. So for example, if you had 100 containers in a batch, so that's greater than 3, you kind of follow that along and use the equation to get the number of containers to be sampled. So in this case, the number of containers to be sampled would be the square root of 100, which is 10, plus 1, 11. So there would be 11 containers to be sampled. At the bottom there is a determination of how you would identify the quantity of the batch to be sampled per container. So for example, if you have, let's say, 400 kilograms of cannabis in your batch, that equates to 0.20 of a minimum mass. So then you would have to determine, okay, 0.20 of 400, you have that number, and then divide that by the number of containers you have, and you'll be able to identify the minimum mass of the cannabis that you will need to sample per container. So how do producers find a good lab? And similarly, how can labs prove that they are committed to quality, right? Because you have to find a good match that works for your business. Of course, things like price is a factor, but what are some ways that you could qualify a lab? So there are some best practices that you can consider when qualifying a lab and determining if they are a right fit for you. So up on the screen now, you see an analytical testing license. At the very top of the license, I've kind of blocked out this one here as an example. At the top left would be the license holder's license number. And the second rectangle there would indicate the license holder's name, as well as the license holder's site address. The license indicates the class and subclass. So in this case, it's analytical testing. And the authorized activities are also listed on the license. So for analytical testing, the activities to possess cannabis for the purpose of testing, to obtain cannabis by altering its chemical or physical properties by any means for the purpose of testing. And then the license will list any conditions. The conditions are typically the requirements for mandatory pesticide testing, and points the license holder to the guidance document that outlines what those testing requirements are. And the license includes the effective date of the license and the expiry date of the license. So these are all, great bits of information that's on that license. It's important to request the license from a lab to make sure that they are authorized. And you'll notice that the types of tests that the lab can actually do is not written on the license. So that's a question you really have to ask the lab and make sure that you have confirmation from them on what they can actually test and that they're authorized to conduct those tests. When a license holder or an applicant applies to become a license holder for analytical testing, they all need to select which tests they want to be authorized to test for. And that gets submitted as part of the CTLS submission, but it's not shown on the license itself. So it's important to confirm with the lab which tests they're authorized to conduct, and that they're able to offer you that type of testing. If you're looking for a full service lab that performs, all the tests that are required, then that's something important that you need to know, right? Or if you need to do some tests at one lab and some at another, it kind of gets confusing, can be messy or expensive. So it's important to get that information. Currently, there are 146 analytical testing labs authorized under the Cannabis Act. Health Canada does have a website that lists the authorized analytical testing labs, so you can find that information. It'll indicate their name and the provinces that they're located in. So you can find that information on Health Canada's website. Other aspects that is important to consider when looking for a lab is considering whether or not they have any certifications. There are some common certifications that labs typically have or are in the process of getting. One being ISO 9001, which is an international standard that specifies requirements for a quality management system. It implements quality management principles for customer-focused leadership and process approach. And just to provide a little bit of explanation, the ISO stands for International Organization for Standards, and it's essentially an organization that establishes standards that are just kind of distilled down by individuals with specific expertise that are subject matter experts who understand the needs of the people that they represent, the organizations that they represent. So it's regulated industries, manufacturers, sellers, buyers, and establish a clear set of standards. Another certification that's great for labs, and that labs I think really should have, is ISO 17025, which is an international standard for testing and calibration of labs. It's established with the aim of offering quality and improving the processes within labs. So labs with this certification, you have this assurance that they are committed to quality, that there's some standard and guidance that they are responsible to adhering to. Another certification is GLP, or Good Laboratory Practices. It's a quality system covering the organization's process conditions under which non-clinical lab studies are performed or planned, monitored, recorded, reported, and archived. So it's a very lab-specific certification. And finally, GMP, Current Good Manufacturing Practices. GMP stands for Good Manufacturing Practices, and it's a quality-driven system of regulations, codes, procedures, guidelines to kind of set a consistent standard of quality. And areas that come into play under GMP include the facilities, the building, the equipment, processes, the production, anything, packaging, labeling, all aspects of the business in terms of its facility and processes, and even the people as well. And GMP is also applicable to labs. It's not just manufacturing facilities. And this becomes very important when you are looking at international markets. GMP is very common in the pharmaceutical industry. It is a pharmaceutical industry standard. And in many jurisdictions outside of Canada, the framework that's employed is a medical cannabis framework. And because of it being a medical cannabis framework and seeing cannabis more as a medicine or a drug, it lends more to requirements of GMP. And that becomes very important, not just from the manufacturing, but also from the testing aspect as well, and having a lab that can accommodate GMP. So why GMP? It reduces variation in a task or outcome through very defined procedures, so that the procedures will establish a product that is very reproducible and robust. And that kind of goes back to the processes in place to produce that product, right? So that it's very clear and reproducible and limits any type of deviation or error. It ensures each task happens the same way each time. So again, having very clear documentation and steps that are very prescriptive, and it protects patient and consumers by having these detailed records. Benefits for GMP certification include having consistent product quality, efficiency, reduces waste, allows for traceability, allows for evidence for quality and safety, and export to international markets. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Other aspects to consider when looking at a lab include equipment and method validation. So we know that cannabis is, quite a complex plant. It contains many cannabinoids, over 130 cannabinoids, with the primary cannabinoids being CBD and delta-9 THC. And we know that there are other cannabinoids that are in the cannabis plant, some more well-known like CBN, which is shown, to have sedative properties so that, individuals try to capitalize and use products that have CBN, and they kind of seek those out for those particular reasons. CBC is another popular and well-known cannabinoid as well. And then there are some lesser well-known ones, such as cannabicycloil and cannabicitrin. So how do we test all of these parameters? We've mentioned all the different types of tests that need to be done. How are they really done? How much do you really need to know to kind of understand this? It's not necessary that you need to know, exactly how the equipment is used, but it's important to know that the labs have the right equipment to test what you're looking for. So in terms of cannabinoid profile testing, HPLC, or high performance liquid chromatography, is often used. It identifies the detectable cannabinoids in a complex mixture and provides information on the relative quantities and concentrations. So kind of in simple terms, trying to describe how this equipment works, essentially a liquid sample is injected into the stream of the solvent, which flows through a column. The solvent's kind of pushed through via a pump, and it goes through the column with a separation medium, or they call it a stationary phase, and the sample components selectively interact with the column and are separated from one another based on chemical and physical properties. So there's some selective affinity with the column. And as they flow through the column, they come out and they pass through a detector that gives a voltage response as a function of time. So you'll get a readout of data that shows peaks, and each peak at a specified time correlates to the each molecule type, and that makes up the sample, and the area under the peak represents the quantity of molecules of the particular molecule in that sample. So you'll be able to get information on which cannabinoids are in that sample at detectable levels, and as well as the quantity and concentrations. In terms of testing for pesticides and mycotoxins, this is super important to test. Toxins are produced by fungi that can contaminate agricultural crops, including cannabis, right, as a crop. So in the case of cannabis, the presence of toxins can pose a significant health risk to consumers, especially those who use cannabis for medical purposes, as patients with a compromised immune system or pre-existing condition. They could be very vulnerable to the effects of cannabis and may experience some serious adverse health effects because of this exposure. Toxins and pesticides are tested using a liquid chromatography tandem mass spectrometry, or LC-MS, and it combines basically the separation capabilities of liquid chromatography and the detection of and identification capabilities of a mass spec, where the mass spec essentially ionizes or produces a negative or positive charge to the molecules to further separate them by mass to charge ratio. So this instrument's often used for detection of small molecules and, such as environmental contaminants and toxins and pesticides. Heavy metals are, as we know, highly toxic when consumed in excess, and can be, dangerous and not essential for metabolism. Cannabis plants, especially if they're grown outdoors, they pick up heavy metals very readily from soil. So that's why it's important to also consider soil testing in some situations, particularly if you're cultivating outdoors, to be sure of the type of soil at your location, to make sure that it is suitable, that there isn't any risk of heavy metals coming into that cannabis. The heavy metals that are often tested include cadmium, lead, arsenic, or mercury. Although other metals may be tested for, if you have some concern that there might be an issue with the soil, or if you are looking to export to other countries. Some other countries have other specific requirements for heavy metals that must be tested as part of that export. Heavy metals are tested using inductively coupled plasma mass spec, or ICP-MS, and it's capable of detecting metals at very low concentrations. So it's super sensitive, and it could detect as low as 1 parts per quadrillion. And the ICP-MS unit ionizes or charges the sample using inductively coupled plasma. Residual solvents. This really comes into play for cannabis extracts depending on the extraction process. Residual solvents are tested using headspace analysis gas chromatography coupled with mass spectrometry, or HSGCMS. And it is an analytical technique that is commonly used in testing volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds in complex matrices, such as food, pharmaceuticals, environmental samples, and cannabis samples. Terpene profile testing is tested using the same instrument. We know how important terpenes are to cannabis and cannabis products. It's often sought after by consumers. They'd like to know which terpenes are contained in cannabis products. And we know that there are some contributions of terpenes to the entourage effect. Another aspect to consider when looking at labs is method validation. Method validation is a process of demonstrating that a particular lab method or procedure is reliable, it's accurate, and consistent for its intended purpose. Validating a method involves assessing the method's performance characteristics, so considering accuracy, precision, specificity, limit of detection, linearity, range, robustness, and other parameters. The validation process typically involves a series of experiments or studies that evaluate the method's performance, right? So usually you'll have, when you're looking at a test method for a particular sample with a known concentration or properties, and comparing the results to expected values or reference methods. And it's important, of course, to know that when you validate a method, that it's not just a one-time process, that it should be periodically reviewed and updated to ensure that there's continued performance and reliability to that method. So you want to ask, does the lab have validated methods to test your product formats? It's also very specific to the product format, because, for example, if you have a gummy and you have a cookie, the matrices are not the same. So the lab has to be able to create a way of validating that method for that particular matrix of your product. So it's not just a category, it's not just edible cannabis that they need to create a method validation for. It becomes a little bit more specific than that. Testing is conducted using validated methods on a representative sample of each lot or batch of cannabis or cannabis accessory that contains cannabis. The methods should be validated in accordance with the applicable method and specification in the chosen pharmacopoeia. And license holders must also retain documentation describing the validated test methods used, and any assessment made by the license holder ensuring the methods are validated. So the labs are the ones making sure that they have validated methods, but it's also the license holder that's ensuring that the lab that they selected really do in fact have validated methods, and that the lab is providing them copies of the validated methods, some evidence that they are validated and sufficient for the appropriate tests and the appropriate products. And the license holder must maintain that documentation at their facility. So if they're ever audited, they can provide that information to Health Canada. The documentation describing the validated test method must be retained for at least 2 years after the day on which they are obtained or replaced. So if the lab reviews their validation method and they revalidate, then you need to have, as a license holder, that updated copy of the validation test method. Most labs are, kind of pretty good at disseminating that information, but it's important to check with your lab to ask, have you updated this method? Can you provide that to me? So just something to be aware of. So just kind of a quick reminder, summary kind of here. Not all labs have the same equipment. Not all labs have all the equipment. Not all labs have validated methods for all tests and or products. And not all labs can perform the same or all tests. So it's an important kind of thing to think of at the back of your mind when you're talking to labs and assessing whether or not they're a good fit for you. Certificates of analysis is another key part of determining if a lab is suitable. The certificate of analysis is an official document issued by a qualified lab. It summarizes the results of the test performed. Many times, or your lab should, that you're looking for, be able to provide you with a sample of what the certificate of analysis will look like, so you're sure that it captures all the information that a C of A should have. It should confirm the product is within a predetermined specification criteria, so it should have somewhere on the documentation that would allow for that type of information. It is issued for each batch or lot, so you have to make sure that the certificate of analysis has an area where it details the batch number or the lot number. The C of A should also list the test performed in accordance with a certain pharmacopoeia, include the method used, the specification limit, and an area for indicating the result, whether it's a numerical result or if it's a pass or fail result, depending on the specific test and if that's suitable for that specific test. And it should be dated and signed by an authorized personnel of the lab. So for example, specifically the head of lab. And this brings us to another consideration, which is ensuring that the lab itself has qualified staff. Every analytical testing license holder is required to have a head of lab. They are required to have specific qualifications and training approved by Health Canada. Health Canada has recently amended the regs to include a broadened educational requirement for a head of lab position. So it includes diplomas or certificates in chemistry, biology, a lab technician, pharmaceutical or scientific regulatory affairs, or laboratory management. And this individual, aside from their educational accomplishments, should also have actual practical experience that can support that they can, actually work in a lab, that they know how to run equipment, that they know how to read results. It's not as prescriptive as the requirements for a quality assurance person for a processor. So you kind of have to use that to look at your discretion when you're either a lab that's hiring a head of lab, or thinking that Health Canada is going to completely vet this person with the stringency that they do for a quality assurance person, because I think right now it's not really as detailed as that. And as the license holder, it's important to have an idea of how qualified the staff are at the lab. Oftentimes labs have other qualified staff to support the head of lab, so there can be laboratory analysts and other technicians as well. Another aspect to consider are records. So ensure that there's a copy of the certificate of accreditation, if the lab does have one, if they have any specific certifications, get information on the method validation, how they did that, ensure that they can provide documentation to you, ask questions about equipment calibration. Oftentimes that's part of how they validate, and it kind of could come as a complete package. Ask for a sample test report or certificate of analysis, so you know what that looks for. Staff qualifications, any audits if they have been audited by Health Canada or any other certification body, that would be good to know. And you know, if there were any corrective actions that needed to be taken for that has been addressed. And the types of equipment that they have, that it's some confirmation from the lab that they can perform the tests that they that you're looking for, and that they have the appropriate equipment. And you could test your lab. How consistent are they with the sample? You can, if you're curious to see how consistent they are, you could send them the same sample 3 different times. You could, you know, send them over a course of a day and see, are you getting back the same result from the 3 samples that are the same, and you sent them to the lab? Are they the same? How consistent are they? And are they transparent and helpful? Labs, I find, are very helpful. They want to work within a quality system. They want to help license producers, and they are helpful. They know that it's oftentimes outside the expertise of their clients. So they really try to help make the process as easy and seamless as possible and comply with the cannabis regulations. So let's kind of talk about some industry realities and challenges within the area of cannabis testing. So we kind of know that there's a lot of discussion within the industry. Some of the concerns that are continuously brought up it includes the fact that there are no national standardized testing methods or data recording within our cannabis framework here in Canada. Health Canada does not accredit labs through the testing procedures or methods. They approve labs, issue them licenses, but as part of the submission process, they're not, getting into fine details of how they're validating, which equipment they have, are does the equipment that they do have, how specific is it, and how does it correlate to the tests that they're saying that they want to conduct at their particular facility. So there isn't really that oversight yet at Health Canada at that detail anyways. There is also variability in cannabis products that we've been seeing and amongst labs. Innovative products and formats with complex matrices, it does pose a challenge to labs, right? They need to kind of figure out how they're going to validate methods for that, and that takes some time to develop, right? You need to have the right equipment and the right expertise to be able to do that successfully. There's limited availability of certified reference standards. Health Canada has made that a little bit easier with some of the amended changes to the regulations by allowing analytical testing license holders to develop standards and without having the need of getting a processing license. So they're now able to do that within their analytical testing license, which is making it, I think, easier, at least moving forward. And cost and time, volume constraints still pose a challenge. Health Canada's mandatory cannabis testing for pesticides typically costs anywhere between $500 to $800 per lot that you send in. So the costs are quite prohibitive, especially for new or smaller companies that may be in the early stage of product development, right? And they don't really have that capital. But it's a mandatory test, needs to be done. So I mean, it is quite expensive. And in terms of volume, some labs do experience backlogs because they're a popular lab, whether that's because of pricing or the services that they offer and the support that they offer. Some labs are, quite busy, and there are 146 authorized license holders for analytical testing. Right now, not all of them have the same scope of services that they're offering. Not all of them have the are actually even operating and up and running yet. So compared to the number of license holders that there are, it's it creates a bit of a bottleneck sometimes. There are concerns around the industry regarding the frequency of, I guess, variability of THC results among labs for dried cannabis and concentrates, specifically high THC, greater than 25% weight per weight lab results for dried cannabis, which is really being sought by license holders as a result of consumers wanting that, consumers asking for high THC products, right? And going into retail stores and wanting that. And that's what's selling right now. And license holders can get higher prices for high THC. So, it kind of makes sense. But as a result of that, we're seeing that there is this, I guess, pressure to produce products that are high THC, and for labs to be able to also, produce those results as well. So we're kind of, in the industry, you're thinking, well, why is this happening, right? And I think it's not always out of something dishonest. I think that there are differences in results among labs that can be contributed to a variety of factors. There could be variability in instruments. I talked a lot about instruments kind of broadly and what they do, but the fact of the matter is that some instruments are more sensitive and precise than others, depending on the brand. Usually the more expensive ones have more capabilities, and they're usually more expensive. And you can't necessarily say that, okay, all labs need to produce this particular instrument, because they are quite expensive. Lab equipment is quite expensive. And I think in the next panel, some of the labs might talk about that in a little bit more detail. But they can't, the instruments themselves can vary. There's variability within the batches. There are some challenges sometimes with the accuracy and precision of the test method. And again, as I was mentioning, there's no standardized method, right? So there's going to be some variability there on the methods themselves. Cannabinoid content can also be calculated in a few different ways. There is a correction factor that you apply to THC and CBD as you account for the acid form. And you kind of want to know, like, how is your lab actually calculating that, right? Are they doing a straight calculation, or are they considering a correction factor? And some labs even have a correction factor on the correction factor. So you could actually get a little bit of variation in the cannabinoid content. How accurate are the reference standards, right? The representative sample, there's variation on what the sampling practices are. Not every license holder samples the exact same way. And there is guidance on it, but at the end of the day, how robust are the procedures that the license holder have in place to be able to sample? And there's going to be variation how that sampling is being determined ultimately, right, in the SOPs. And of course, there's variation in lab personnel qualifications and experience. So that plays a role in it. Of course, it's just personnel differences. And I wanted to mention lab shopping versus lab switching. So we are seeing lab shopping in the industry, and that conversation kind of comes up often, that, well, people are kind of going around to find the lab that will give them the desired result, right? The desired high THC result. So they'll kind of shop around to which lab can produce that. And it's not really fair to say that it's the fault of the lab that they're producing high THC results disingenuinely. I think that for the reasons that I mentioned there can be some differences in results. But again, nonetheless, aside of that, lab shopping does happen. And it's a reality that's happening in the industry right now. And there's a difference between lab shopping versus switching labs because of, some of a business reason of why you're switching labs, whether that is cost, or you don't no longer have a good relationship with them, or because you are not satisfied with the results that you're getting. There's kind of a difference between those two things, right? And an issue is that labs are not being inspected by Health Canada, right? Like, compared to licensed producers, we know that they're on a schedule of inspection. It could be more frequent, as well, just for the commercial producers. But in terms of labs, they're really not being inspected. There are some labs that have been inspected, but it's not often. And I think that it's important to consider that, having inspections by Health Canada to ensure that requirements are being met and upheld is of course super important in any regulated industry, and is the expectation of license holders. But again, when you want the inspectors to come in, you want to have inspectors that are kind of qualified, have the right education and technical knowledge and experience with things like methods and validation and the instruments to be able to really inspect properly, right? And another point here is market competition. So the drive for having higher THC is kind of fueled by that market competition. Again, consumers want higher THC products, so producers and labs can feel this pressure of that. And we know that high THC flower remains the highest selling consumer product in Canada. So just some thoughts there. So in terms of cannabis export, certifications for export for any regulated industry is, fairly standard. And it's done to ensure that, you kind of have access. It gives you access to most global markets, and most products require some sort of certification. Certifications aim to ensure legal requirements are met, ensures quality, builds trust, and allows for access to new markets. And it's very important and required in highly regulated industries like cannabis. It's common for third parties to certify the cultivation of raw materials of agricultural origin. So, for example, coffee, sugar, fruit, and vegetables. Cannabis is a crop, so it completely makes sense of why certification would be required. The foundation of most mandatory standards include responsible agriculture, social responsibility, traceability, compliance, legalities, and there are some voluntary standards, but those are also, driven by these types of foundation. There is a need for certifying cannabis, especially as more and more countries develop a framework for cultivation and processing of medical cannabis. So most often this is a medical framework. Current food standards are not suitable for medical cannabis, and pharmaceutical standards rely on good agricultural and collection practices, or GACP, and GMP, which is, a pharmaceutical standard, as I was mentioning before. So cannabis doesn't really fit into food. They kind of lend more to pharmaceutical GMP and GACP practices, specifically for cannabis that is, considered medical or therapeutic within those frameworks. So GACP certification, GMP certification, other supporting certifications such as phytosanitary certification, which looks at things like pests in soil and ensuring that a product is free of that before entering another country. Those types of certifications need to be considered when looking at exports. And analytical testing requirements are fairly country specific. Health Canada does have their testing requirements, as we've talked about through this presentation, and license holders are required to not only not sell products if they don't meet the specifications, but they can't export as well. So the same tests that you're doing for releasing your product for sale within the Canadian framework, those same tests need to be completed for an export, in addition to any other tests that may be required for the specific jurisdiction that you're exporting the product to. Testing considerations for export include specific sampling points. So looking at things like the population represented by the sampling phase. So you could look at things like the vegetative phase. Do they want, samples of the mother? Looking at the sampling area as well. What part do they want to sample, top, middle, bottom, or any other part of the plant as well? The quantity and concentration of active ingredients generally focus on THC and CBD for international markets, but sometimes there can be others that are included as part of the requirements of the importer. Metals and heavy metals, and especially heavy metals, are required as well. Oftentimes that requirement is more prescriptive than in Canada, and often includes additional metals like nickel and zinc. Microbial factors are also generally more prescriptive than in Canada. The requirements in other international markets tend to look at other microbials like Shigella and Listeria and others as well. Again, similarly, toxins are looked at and tend to be a bit more prescriptive than Canada. And pesticide residues are considered on again, a country-specific basis. The pesticides are often tied to national regulations and guidelines and approved by their individual regulatory bodies for the exact pesticide residue limits. So you'll have to satisfy what's in Canada, but also satisfy what is in the other jurisdiction as well, and if there are any additional pesticides that they're looking at. And humidity levels are also, I find, more prescriptive and oftentimes required. And in addition to these test considerations, the exporter from Canada will also need to meet the requirements of the importer's supplier qualification program. So the partner company that you're working with in your selected jurisdiction, or the importer, will have a supplier qualification program, and they may request very specific requirements even outside of what is required nationally from their country. Oftentimes it's quite aligned, but they might also have some other specific asks of you when you're looking to export. Just to kind of cover some countries that are popular for exports, Germany is one of the largest importers of medical cannabis in Europe. Canadian companies have consistently exported to Germany since 2017. And the cannabis industry and that trade to Germany has continued to grow over the years. In 2018, German pharmacies sold an estimated almost 3,000 kilograms of cannabis flower, and it more than doubled in the amount sold than the previous year. In 2019, through BFarm, which is, the German government, they awarded contracts to Canadian and Dutch companies to supply medical cannabis, specifically flower and oil, to the country, and that included Canadian companies Afria and Aurora. In 2023, so even now, Germany's medical cannabis market is consistently growing, and Canada continues to be a top supplier of dried flower and extracts. So there's definitely a strong relationship between Canada and Germany. Health Canada is very familiar with the companies that and the German government for export from Canada to Germany. So typically that's a market that Canadian companies like to look to, and imported cannabis from jurisdictions outside of Germany are required to be GACP or GMP and meet those standards, and that includes consideration of a GMP lab. Israel is one of the first countries to accept international exports. They have a local regulation that require farms to obtain a specific certification, the IMC GMP certification that's developed as part of their framework. Recognizing that there was no specific standard for medical cannabis, and that was developed in conjunction with the Israeli Ministry of Health and with a standards organization called the Control Union. For medical cannabis coming outside of Israel, the Control Union created a specific standard, the CUMCS GAP standard, which it's fully JCP compliant and goes even beyond that. And the Control Union certifies and audits, so they actually can come to Canada to do that audit. Australia is currently seen kind of as a go-to country right now for cannabis exports. A lot of Canadian companies are turning to Australia. They do have specific manufacturing requirements per the Therapeutic Goods Order 93 and specific standards that apply to that. Currently, GMP and JCP may not be required. Just in this brief couple of months, there is in kind of a pathway of working with partner companies in Australia to be able to leverage their GMP facility to be able to export cannabis from Canada. But in July 2023, the Therapeutic Goods Administration and TGA will begin enforcing that cannabis must be under GMP conditions from the moment refinement begins. So this is changing, and GMP is really becoming important here. So just to wrap up, some forward-looking thoughts. Again, there's a lot of kind of like nuances and challenges, of course, that the industry is facing, and it's Not completely surprising. We are a relatively young industry, so in order for us to grow and to remain competitive on a global scale, it's important that we consider improvements and continue to work together to achieve those goals as an industry. So all the industry stakeholders, whether it's Health Canada, testers, producers, associations, consultants, we kind of have a great purview and bring different perspectives on the industry. And it's important that we all have a voice and kind of move the industry forward with Health Canada. So providing clarity on analytical testing methods, appropriate validation, acceptance criteria for finished products for various classes would be, very beneficial to the industry. It will allow for harmonizing testing, unifying the industry's understanding of a minimum acceptance criteria, and better align with international testing standards for participation in a global trade, right? We don't want Canada to be left behind. It's important, I think, for moving forward for labs to hold quality certifications. I think that is, a very important also on a global perspective. And it's really important, I think, for Health Canada to seriously consider conducting preliminary as well as regular inspections of lab to kind of, ensure that compliance is fully considered across the board. So I'm going to leave it here, and thank you very much for your time today. If you'd like to get in touch with me, my contact is there. You can send an email to info@CannDelta.com or check us out online at CannDelta.com. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sherry. I've got a question just before we go to break that I'd love to ask you.
Sure.
Okay, awesome. So you mentioned labs aren't often inspected by Health Canada. Is there a scenario where a lab could be inspected and found to be unable to substantiate, quote, high cannabinoid results? And if so, what are the implications to the licensed producer?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. There can be situations. So typically Health Canada has an inspection schedule of when they conduct testing. It is, it's kind of come to everyone's attention that labs are not really being inspected. However, Health Canada does take inspections kind of, unannounced or unplanned when there is some associated compliance or non-compliance risk or observation that can come into their purview. So say, for example, they're inspecting a licensed producer and they have some, they come to a determination that there can be an issue with a particular lab and it requires further investigation. They can correspond with their team that can conduct testing of analytical testing license holder. In addition to that, there are opportunities for stakeholders or really anyone in the public to submit concerns or complaints to Health Canada, and they have a responsibility to investigate that concern or complaint on their end, and that can involve conducting an inspection of a lab if they find that there is a risk to the safety of Canadians or a risk of diversion. And there's reason for an investigation in that process. If that were to happen, Health Canada would check all of they would kind of go through their requirements per the regulation. And of course, all the observations need to be tied to a specific regulation in the Cannabis Act and regulations. They will look at things like documentation, how they're calibrating the methods that are instated for at that particular lab, qualifications of the personnel. And I think there's the last bit of your question there. What was the last question?
It was, and if so, what are the implications for the licensed producer?
Great. For the licensed producer as the producer or the tester?
The producer.
The producer, okay. So if it is determined that it was an issue with the lab, what Health Canada would be looking for on the producer side is to kind of dig into, okay, what did the license holder do that was within their control? What were their steps in investigating a specific lab? If there was an issue with a test result, for example, and they say that it's out of specification, and they found that there was something non-compliant occurring at a particular lab, what did the license holder do to ensure that they were working within their due diligence? Health Canada will look at, okay, how did they qualify that lab? What documents were recorded as part of their investigation? What were the corrective steps in that process as well, in determining if there was an issue with that lab? And if the license holder determines that there is reason to report a particular issue, the license holder actually does have that ability to submit that information to Health Canada. But what Health Canada ultimately will be looking for is what information and documentation does the license holder have on their end to tell a complete story, and are they still working within their requirements of the cannabis regulations, and are they meeting their obligations?